At Christmas dinner, I realised I wasn't just the outsider, I was erased. My name wasn't on the family gift list, my chair was missing from the table, and then my father, Richard Turner, raised his glass and said, "Rachel won't be inheriting anything, it's all going to the boys." Everyone laughed, except me, because they didn't know what I knew. They didn't know Forbes had just released its billionaire list. And the woman they just disowned was sitting at the table, at number 11. Rachel Turner tightened her grip on the steering wheel as her black rental SUV hummed along the snowy Ohio highway. Her childhood town of Brookhaven loomed in the distance, nestled beneath a grey winter sky. It had been 7 years, 7 Christmases, without phone calls, without invitations, without family. And yet here she was, answering her mother's polite, almost apologetic email. It would mean a lot if you came home this year. She was 38 now, CEO of a company that had recently finalised one of the most talked about acquisitions in medtech. In Silicon Valley, she was known, respected, even feared by competitors. But at home, in the Turner family, she was invisible. Rachel had always known her place in the family hierarchy, beneath her 2 brothers, Brian and Sean. Brian, the eldest, had taken over operations at Turner Manufacturing. Sean, the middle child, ran client relationships. Her father, Richard Turner, considered them worthy heirs, built from his mould, groomed from birth to lead the company. Rachel? She was the mistake in the middle. At age 12, she'd asked her father if she could shadow him at work over summer break. He had laughed, not kindly, and told her, "Go help your mother in the kitchen. Business isn't a place for girls." Even then, something hardened in her. She wasn't soft like her mother, Ellen, who moved like a shadow in their home, quiet and compliant, always smoothing the rough edges of Richard's stern commands. Ellen loved Rachel. Rachel knew that. But love in that house was a silent, timid thing, not loud enough to protect her. When it came time to apply for college, Rachel had been accepted to Caltech's elite engineering program. It was everything she had worked for, but the scholarship only covered part of the tuition. She had mustered the courage to ask her father for help. "I'm not spending a dime, so you can go play with computers across the country," he had said, not looking up from his ledgers. "You want to go, you figure it out." So she had. She took a year off, working double shifts at a diner by day and doing bookkeeping for small businesses by night. She barely slept, ate on her feet, and taught herself basic code during breaks. When she finally stepped onto Caltech's campus, it was without family, without support, but with every ounce of determination she had. Now, 17 years later, she was returning to the house where all of it started. To the white-pillared colonial on Sycamore Lane that always smelled like lemon polish and disappointment. A house full of memories she had spent a lifetime trying to outgrow. Rachel pulled into the driveway, noting how little had changed. The same wreath on the door, the same crack in the front step, the same silence behind her father's perfectly trimmed hedges. She checked her appearance in the mirror. No designer labels, no flashy jewellery, just a simple wool coat, jeans and boots. Her hair was pulled back, and the expensive watch on her wrist, custom made when her company hit its first 1 million users, was tucked beneath her sleeve. She didn't want to give them anything to talk about. Not yet. As she rang the doorbell, her heart pounded, not with fear, but with restraint. 7 years had changed her. She had outgrown their indifference. But now, walking back into the house, where she had always been less than, she could already feel the old ghosts waiting to claim her again. The door opened. Her mother's face lit up. "Rachel," she whispered, as if saying it too loud might wake something. "You came." Rachel's eyes lingered on the road ahead as she steered the SUV into the familiar streets of Brookhaven. The town hadn't changed much in 7 years, but for some reason everything felt smaller now, including her. She slowed down as her eyes caught something unexpected. STEM Girls Centre Bennett Scholarship Fund. The bright blue sign stood out against the snow-covered street, almost mocking her. Rachel had never seen it before, and yet in that moment it felt like a jolt to her memory. The Bennett Scholarship Fund. It was a name that carried weight in her life, but she never thought she would see it in her hometown. The scholarship had been her lifeline, the only real recognition she had ever received for her passion. She remembered receiving that small cheque, that letter back in high school, written by Mrs. Bennett, the one teacher who had believed in her when no one else did. Rachel had dreamed of creating a place just like this, an institution that supported young women who wanted to break into STEM fields. She imagined building a centre like this one, where girls who were overlooked, just like she had been, would have a place to belong. But that had never happened. As she parked the car in front of her old family home, Rachel could feel a flicker of something deep within her chest, pride, sadness and regret all tangled up together. The STEM Girls Centre was a dream she hadn't gotten to fulfil. Not yet at least, but it was also a sign of how far she had come. And still it hurt. It hurt because it wasn't her name on that sign. It was just the scholarship she had received. The place she once imagined creating for others had been built without her. She gathered her thoughts and walked towards the door, the heavy weight of nostalgia sinking into her bones. Her mother opened the door with a warm, albeit nervous, smile. "Rachel, sweetheart." "Welcome back," she said, her voice soft with relief. Rachel nodded, her emotions held in check. "Hi, Mum. It's good to be home." The smell of home-cooked meals filled the air, a familiar, comforting scent that reminded her of long-forgotten days when things were simpler. Her mother, despite her quiet and ever-supportive nature, always had a way of making Rachel feel like she mattered. It was never enough to change her father's treatment of her, but at least her mother had been a constant presence in her life. Rachel followed her inside where the family was gathered around the dining room table. Brian and Sean were in the living room discussing something with their wives, while Richard sat in his usual armchair by the fireplace, his gaze immediately locking onto her. "Rachel," her father said, acknowledging her with a slight nod, but not bothering to rise from his chair. Rachel had been prepared for this, but it still stung. The coldness was familiar. "Hi, Dad," she replied, her voice steady. It wasn't the warm reunion she had hoped for, but it was expected. Her mother led her to the table, where the others were already seated. The conversation quickly shifted to business, as it always did. Her father and brothers were discussing the latest quarter's profits, their usual topic of conversation. Rachel could feel herself becoming an invisible observer once again, the outsider she had always been. But then something unexpected caught her eye. On the mantelpiece was a stack of articles. Several of them had her name on them, features from years past. Rachel's breath caught in her throat as she saw how her mother had kept them all, as though she had silently held on to her daughter's successes all along. Her mother, in her quiet way, had always been proud of Rachel's accomplishments. Rachel's eyes welled up as she thought back to all the times her mother had silently supported her. No applause, no grand gestures, just the quiet act of holding on to each article, each piece of validation that Rachel had longed for from her family. But in the silence of the room, there was no acknowledgement of Rachel's success, no recognition from her father, no celebration from her brothers. The weight of the moment hung in the air. And then it hit her. The one thing she had always craved, being seen for who she was, not what she did, was something her family could never give her. Rachel took a deep breath, wiping away the tears that threatened to fall. As she sat at the table, she made a silent promise to herself. She no longer needed their approval. She no longer needed to be validated by the people who had dismissed her for so long. She was enough, and this Christmas she would finally begin to prove it. Rachel Turner's first job out of college was at a small, scrappy startup in the heart of Silicon Valley. It wasn't glamorous. The pay barely covered rent on her tiny studio apartment in a neighbourhood that still smelled of paint and new buildings. But it was all she could afford, and in a city where every corner seemed to whisper of success, Rachel had nothing to do but prove herself. The company was barely hanging on. The CEO, a well-meaning but frazzled visionary, often seemed one bad month away from selling the whole thing off. The startup was a health tech company focused on developing a new software system that would help doctors diagnose rare diseases faster and more accurately. It was the kind of project that excited Rachel: technology, data, the chance to change the world. But with only a few employees, limited funding, and an intimidating workload, every day felt like walking a tightrope. She learned quickly, too quickly sometimes. The long nights at the office, running code that would break when she least expected it, fixing bugs that always seemed to find new ways to pop up. She didn't sleep much. When the other employees went home at night, she stayed at her desk, coding in the stillness. There were moments when the exhaustion almost crushed her, when the weight of it all made her question why she had left everything behind in Ohio for this uncertain path. Then came the turning point. One day, a call came in from a prestigious hospital in New York. A patient, a young girl, had been misdiagnosed multiple times and her condition was worsening. The doctors didn't know what was wrong with her. The case had stumped specialists and they had no answers. The hospital had heard about the startup software and they wanted to test it on the girl's case. Rachel didn't expect much, but she dove in anyway. She input the data, ran the algorithms, and waited. The hours dragged by in silence. When the results finally came through, her stomach dropped. It was a rare neurological disorder, something the specialists had overlooked, but her software had caught it immediately. Rachel felt her heart pound as she read the results, confirming what the system had flagged. She printed out the report and sent it off to the hospital, praying that the doctors would believe her. The next day, she received a call from the hospital's chief neurologist. The diagnosis was confirmed. They'd never seen a more accurate report and they were starting treatment right away. The young girl was going to be okay. That one case, that one success changed everything. It wasn't just the recognition from the hospital or the doctors, it was the validation. Rachel wasn't just a coder anymore. She was a problem solver, a professional who could change lives. The next few months saw the company's fortunes change. The patient's recovery went viral in the medical community, and soon other hospitals were requesting the software. The small team at the startup worked around the clock to scale up to meet the growing demand. Investors took notice. A Series A funding round opened, and the company was able to secure the capital they desperately needed. The future suddenly seemed bright. For Rachel, the success of the Series A was bittersweet. She had worked tirelessly for it, but she couldn't help but feel a pang of loneliness when the rest of the company celebrated. They were all congratulating each other, the CEOs, the investors, the others who had been in the trenches with her. She was proud of what she'd achieved, but it was hard not to feel like an outsider again. The startup had officially gone from a barely surviving company to one of the most talked about health tech firms in the valley. But Rachel knew the real work was just beginning. Now, it wasn't just about staying afloat. It was about leading, about pushing forward, about creating something bigger than herself. She had learned how to survive the startup grind, but now she was ready to thrive. As she sat at her desk that night, watching the glow of the city lights below, Rachel knew that this was just the start of something much bigger. And for the first time in her life, she believed she was ready for it. Rachel sat in her modest office at the startup, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. The success of the Series A funding round should have felt like a victory lap, but instead there was a gnawing emptiness at the core of her chest. As the team celebrated in the background, Rachel couldn't shake the feeling that she was still searching for something, validation perhaps, or simply recognition for the woman she had become. Her thoughts drifted back to her family in Ohio. She hadn't spoken to her father, Richard, in over a year. Their relationship had always been strained, built on a foundation of disappointment and neglect. She had made the conscious decision to cut ties with her family, determined to prove to herself that she could succeed on her own terms. But even now, in the glow of success, she couldn't escape the ache of being unseen. Just as she began to shake off the feeling, something caught her eye on her desk. It was an old envelope, yellowed with age, tucked under a pile of work papers. Rachel hadn't seen it before. As she picked it up and flipped it over, she noticed the familiar handwriting on the front. It was from her father. She hesitated for a moment, but curiosity won out. Slowly, she tore open the envelope and unfolded the letter inside. Her heart skipped a beat as she read the first few lines, her mind immediately racing back to her childhood. "Brian is showing such promise," the letter began. "I think it's time we start discussing his future with the company. I'm worried about the direction it will take once I retire. He has a good head on his shoulders. He could lead this company into the future. I just hope he's ready, so..." The letter went on, discussing Richard's vision for the company, his plans for Brian to take over, and his hopes that Brian would keep things in the family. It was everything Rachel had never been told. Her father had never once mentioned her when talking about the company, never once expressed an ounce of hope or pride in her abilities. And here, in black and white, was the truth she had always known, but had never fully understood. Her father had never believed in her. Rachel felt her chest tighten. She reread the letter, the words growing more painful with every line. The hope she had once clung to, the faint belief that perhaps her father did care, shattered in that moment. The tears that she had long kept locked inside suddenly came rushing to the surface. She had spent so much of her life trying to win his approval, hoping that one day he would see her for who she truly was. But it had all been in vain. He didn't see her, not really. For a brief moment, she considered calling him, confronting him about the letter, demanding answers. But then something inside her shifted. She realised she didn't need his approval anymore. She had spent years building something for herself, something that mattered. It wasn't about the company, it wasn't about her father, it was about the journey, the struggles, and the strength it had taken to get here. She had earned this, and no one, not even her father, could take that away from her. Rachel crumpled the letter and tossed it into the trash. It was time to let go of the past, time to stop waiting for someone else to give her permission to be who she had always been. She stood up from her desk and walked to the small window that overlooked the city. The view was breathtaking, a reminder of how far she had come from the small town in Ohio. Rachel's reflection stared back at her in the glass, a woman who had fought her way to the top, who had faced rejection and disappointment from the people who should have supported her, and who had come out stronger on the other side. As she gazed at her reflection, a quiet resolution settled within her. She wouldn't share her success with her father. She wouldn't let him take credit for her hard work. She had built this empire on her own, and it was hers alone. The ache in her chest had started to fade, replaced by a sense of clarity. She would continue to build, to grow, to achieve, and when she did, she would do it without the approval of the man who had never believed in her. Turning away from the window, Rachel noticed an old family photo sitting on the shelf. It was taken years ago, a moment frozen in time when her family still seemed like a unit, before everything fell apart. She picked it up, her fingers brushing over the faces of her brothers and parents, the ghosts of a family she no longer recognised. For a moment, Rachel considered telling them, sharing her success with them, showing them how far she had come. But deep down she knew that it wouldn't make a difference. Her success was hers, and it would always be hers. They had never been part of the journey. With a sigh, Rachel put the photo back on the shelf and walked out of the office. The future was waiting, and she was ready to face it, alone if necessary. Rachel stepped out of the car, her boots crunching against the snow as she made her way to the front door. The house in front of her looked just as it always had, the familiar white colonial with its red shutters, the large oak tree that towered over the front yard. It was all exactly the same, but to Rachel it felt foreign. Her heart raced as she rang the doorbell, the sound echoing in the stillness of the evening. The door opened slowly, and Rachel's mother, Ellen, stood there with a hesitant smile. "Rachel, you made it," she said softly, her voice filled with an emotion Rachel couldn't quite place. Rachel nodded, her emotions welling up inside her, but she managed to keep them in check. "Hi, Mum," she replied quietly, stepping inside. The house was warm and smelled of the traditional Christmas feast that had been prepared in the kitchen. The familiar scents of roast turkey, stuffing, and fresh-baked pies filled the air, but Rachel couldn't shake the coldness that hung over the entire house. It had been 7 years since she had sat at this table, and yet it felt like no time had passed at all. The same faces, the same awkward silences, the same unspoken tensions. Her mother led her into the dining room, where the rest of the family was gathered. Her 2 brothers, Brian and Sean, were sitting at the head of the table, chatting casually with their wives. Her father, Richard, sat in his usual spot by the fireplace, watching her with his cold, calculating eyes. The atmosphere in the room was stiff, almost too polite. The small talk felt forced, and Rachel's presence only seemed to highlight the underlying tension. The last 7 years of silence hung between them like a thick fog that no one was willing to acknowledge. Rachel sat down at the table, her chair feeling too small, too far removed from the rest of them. Her brothers exchanged glances, but neither of them said anything. Her father, however, seemed to have no such reservations. He cleared his throat and stood up, drawing the attention of everyone in the room. "Family," Richard began, his voice steady and authoritative. "I have some important news to share with you tonight." Rachel could feel her pulse quicken, her stomach tightening in anticipation. She had been prepared for this moment, but nothing could have prepared her for what came next. Her father looked at her briefly, his gaze cold and dismissive, before turning to her brothers. "As you all know," he continued, "Wilson Manufacturing has been growing steadily. The time has come for us to make some decisions about the future of the company." Rachel felt her breath catch in her throat. She had heard this speech before many times, the family business, the future of the company, the legacy that had always been reserved for her brothers. "I've thought long and hard about this," Richard said, his tone grave. "After careful consideration, I've decided to revise my will. Brian and Sean will inherit equal shares of the company and the majority of the family assets." Rachel's heart sank, the words hitting her like a physical blow. She could feel her face flush with humiliation, but she refused to let the tears spill. She had expected this, of course, but hearing it out loud, made it all the more real. Her father had made it clear, as he always had, that she was not part of his legacy. The room fell silent, and Rachel could feel all eyes on her. Her mother, who had always been the quiet one, looked down at her plate, her hands trembling slightly. Brian and Sean exchanged uncomfortable glances, but neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. The message had been sent loud and clear. Richard turned his gaze to Rachel once more. "You've chosen your own path," he said, his words cold and final. "And while I respect that, you've also chosen to separate yourself from this family and its business. As such, you will not be included in the inheritance." Rachel's grip on her fork tightened. She wanted to say something, to lash out, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she just sat there, the weight of her father's words sinking in. The years of rejection, the constant feeling of being the outsider, all of it came crashing down on her in that one moment. The silence in the room stretched on, suffocating. Rachel could feel the tears threatening to spill, but she swallowed them back. She wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. She had fought too hard, come too far, to let them see her weak. Finally, her father cleared his throat again and sat down. "Well," he said, his voice softer now, "let's enjoy the meal." Rachel remained silent, pushing her food around her plate, not really tasting it. The conversation around the table resumed, but it felt distant, muffled. She was there, but she wasn't. She had never truly been a part of this family, and now she never would be. As the evening dragged on, Rachel couldn't shake the feeling of being invisible, of being a ghost in the very house that should have felt like home. Her father's words echoed in her mind, and despite everything she had achieved, despite the success she had built on her own, it still wasn't enough for him. The coldness of the dinner table settled deep in her bones, but Rachel knew one thing for sure. She was no longer waiting for anyone's approval, not her father's, not her brother's, not anyone's. The silence that followed her father's declaration was suffocating. Rachel could feel the weight of everyone's gaze on her, like 1,000 eyes piercing through her. It wasn't the first time her father had made her feel invisible. But this moment, this public humiliation, cut deeper than anything before. Rachel will not be inheriting anything. Her father's words hung in the air, cold and final. His tone didn't waver. He didn't seem to notice the shock on anyone's face. For him, it was just another matter of business, just another decision in his long line of pragmatic choices. Rachel's jaw tightened. She had braced herself for this moment, but that didn't make it any easier to hear. The weight of rejection, the sting of being cast aside yet again, it was almost too much to bear. Her heart ached with the familiar hurt of being unwanted, of never having been good enough for her father's approval. But something inside her shifted. Instead of succumbing to the wave of emotions that threatened to overwhelm her, she took a deep breath and did the last thing anyone expected. She smiled, a small enigmatic smile that no one in the room could decipher. Her father looked at her, confused by her calmness. He had expected anger, perhaps a tear or two, maybe even a plea to reconsider. But Rachel gave none of that. She sat there, still and composed, the smile lingering at the corners of her lips. She wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of seeing her break. She wasn't going to give him the power to dictate her feelings anymore. Not now, not ever again. As the conversation resumed around the table, Rachel remained quiet, pushing her food around her plate absent-mindedly. Her brothers continued to talk about the family business, discussing expansion plans, client deals and projections for the next quarter, as if Rachel wasn't even in the room. But then, out of the corner of her eye, Rachel noticed Chloe, her young niece, sitting quietly at the table. The 12-year-old had been quiet all evening, eyes glued to her phone. But now Chloe was staring at Rachel, her gaze filled with something that seemed almost admiration. Rachel glanced at her, surprised, and was about to look away when Chloe suddenly leaned over and whispered, "Aunt Rachel, I like how calm you are." Rachel's heart skipped a beat. The words weren't spoken loudly, but they cut through the noise of the room like a sudden sharp wind. She hadn't expected Chloe to notice her at all, let alone say something like that. But in that moment, Rachel realised something. Chloe saw her. Chloe saw her not as a disappointment, not as the daughter who had been cast aside, but as a woman who was unshaken, a woman who could handle the toughest situations without breaking. Rachel's chest swelled with emotion. It was such a simple thing, a small gesture from a young girl, but it was everything. Chloe's words were a quiet confirmation that Rachel had made the right choice all those years ago to walk away, to make her own path. She smiled at Chloe, nodding slightly, and then returned to her meal. The tension in the room was still palpable, but something had shifted inside Rachel. She wasn't going to make a scene. She wasn't going to rise to the bait. Instead, she would let her actions speak for themselves the way they always had. She continued to eat, each bite becoming a symbol of her resolve. As she sat there, surrounded by the family who had never truly seen her, Rachel's mind raced with possibilities. The fire within her, the drive to succeed, was burning brighter than ever. And this dinner, this rejection, would be the spark that fueled her next move. She wasn't done yet, not by a long shot. The world didn't owe her anything. She had learned that the hard way. But now Rachel knew something she hadn't known before. She didn't need her father's approval or her brother's validation. She had already built something of value, and as long as she had the drive to continue, no one could take that away from her. Rachel's eyes moved across the table, meeting her mother's gaze. For a brief moment, they shared a silent understanding. Rachel didn't need to explain. Her mother knew exactly what she was thinking. Rachel had made her peace with the past. Now she was looking toward the future. The dinner continued, but Rachel's mind was already elsewhere. This was only the beginning. The evening had dragged on, each moment more uncomfortable than the last. The tension at the table seemed to stretch, thin as gossamer, but no one was brave enough to snap it. Rachel felt like a ghost among her family, the same ghost she had been for years. The casual conversations about business, growth and expansion all seemed to fade into the background as she turned her thoughts inward, reflecting on the strange, suffocating feeling that had taken hold of her chest ever since her father's announcement. She wasn't sure if it was the smell of the turkey or the clinking of cutlery that made her stomach churn. Maybe it was the oppressive silence from her brothers and the obvious disinterest from her father that made everything feel hollow. She wasn't needed. She wasn't a part of this family anymore. And yet, despite all that, Rachel didn't feel broken. As she sipped her wine and pushed the food around her plate, she heard a familiar voice. "Aunt Rachel, are you really a billionaire?" Rachel blinked, the question hitting her like a sudden gust of wind. She turned to look at Jackson, her teenage nephew, who had his phone in his hands, his eyes wide with shock. Rachel felt her heart skip. Jackson had always been the curious one, the one who asked too many questions, always wanting to know how things worked and why. But this was different. "Jackson, what are you talking about?" Gregory, his father, said, glancing at his son in confusion. But Jackson wasn't paying attention to his father. His focus was entirely on the screen in front of him, his fingers swiping rapidly. "Forbes just released their billionaires list," Jackson said, voice cracking with excitement. "Look, it's her." Rachel froze. Her mind raced as she quickly glanced around the table. Every pair of eyes had turned toward Jackson, who was now holding up his phone for everyone to see. The headline on the screen caught her breath. "Rachel Turner, founder of HealthBridge AI, joins Forbes Billionaire List." The words were like a sudden slap, jarring Rachel out of the quiet storm she had been battling inside. She hadn't planned for this. She hadn't wanted anyone to know. But there it was, on the screen in black and white, a piece of her success laid bare for all to see. The room fell silent. Her father's lips parted in disbelief, his eyes narrowing as he leaned forward, scrutinising the phone. He didn't speak, but the wheels inside his mind seemed to be turning faster than ever before. Rachel could see the flicker of recognition, the dawning realisation that his daughter wasn't just a little computer project anymore. She wasn't just the kid who had gone off to California to chase some hobby. For the first time, Rachel saw the smallest crack in her father's stoic facade. His disbelief shifted into something else, something like curiosity. The silence continued, heavy, as her brothers exchanged glances. The tension was palpable, but Rachel, for the first time that evening, felt a small spark of something inside her. It wasn't joy, it wasn't even satisfaction, it was a quiet sense of power. Finally, Rachel broke the silence. She cleared her throat, catching everyone's attention. "Yes, it's true," she said, her voice calm but firm. "I am on the Forbes list. HealthBridge AI was acquired last month. The company is now valued at $3.2 billion. The words hung in the air, but Rachel felt strangely unaffected by them. This wasn't about the money. It never had been. This was about the journey, the years of struggle and sacrifice, the nights spent alone coding, the failures and the triumphs. She had built something that had changed the way the world looked at healthcare, and no one, least of all her family, could take that away from her. Her father's jaw tightened, and his gaze shifted from the phone back to her. His eyes were cold, calculating. He had always seen business as a battlefield, and Rachel was just another player, one he had never thought worthy of the game. "You never told us about this," her father finally said, his voice low. "We had no idea you were doing so well." The words were a little too casual, a little too measured, and Rachel could tell he was trying to mask the surprise, and perhaps even a bit of shame he felt in that moment. "I didn't tell you because it wasn't about you," Rachel replied evenly. She set her fork down, meeting her father's gaze. "I didn't need your approval. I didn't need your help. I did this on my own, and frankly, I don't need to prove anything to you." There was no anger in her voice. There was no bitterness, just the quiet strength of a woman who had spent years building something for herself, something that no one could take from her. Her brothers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Sean cleared his throat, trying to break the tension. "So, now that you're a billionaire, what's next for you?" he asked, his voice too casual, as though he was simply inquiring about a new business venture. Rachel met his eyes, her expression unreadable. "What's next?" she repeated, almost as if testing the words. "What's next is mine to decide, and I'm not here to discuss that with any of you." The room was dead quiet again. It wasn't the reaction Rachel had expected, but it was the one she needed. This was hers, this success, this moment. It belonged to her, and she wasn't going to let anyone else try to take it from her. The room was still as a tomb. Rachel's words had landed like a bombshell, shattering the silence that had hung heavy around the table for years. Her father's eyes, once filled with disdain, now flickered with something new, something resembling recognition, but still distant, still cold. Her brothers, Brian and Sean, seemed to squirm in their seats, their earlier bravado fading into uncomfortable silence. But none of them spoke. None of them knew what to say. Rachel could feel their eyes on her, but she didn't flinch. She didn't need to prove anything more. The truth was out. She was a billionaire, and nothing could take that away from her. But she wasn't done. Her phone, which had been resting face down on the table beside her, buzzed quietly. Rachel's eyes moved briefly toward it, but she didn't reach for it. Instead, she let the silence hang in the air a moment longer, allowing the weight of her success to sink in. The family wasn't just stunned by the Forbes revelation. They were shocked by her lack of reaction. The others were still recovering from the shock of the moment when Rachel finally leaned forward, her fingers brushing over the screen of her phone. Without a word, she turned it toward them, placing it on the table in full view. The image on the screen was unmistakable. Her name, bold and clear. Rachel Turner, Healthbridge AI Forbes Billionaire List. For a brief second, the family's collective breath seemed to hitch. They hadn't expected this. Rachel, the quiet, reserved daughter who had always been relegated to the background, had just displayed the proof of her success, with nothing but a composed, confident look on her face. It was a stark contrast to the way she'd been dismissed for so long. They expected anger, they expected a plea. Instead, they got silence and strength. Somewhere deep in her, Rachel could feel the old hurt, the sting of rejection from all those years ago. But tonight wasn't about proving something to them. It wasn't about her father's validation. It was about owning her success, quietly, with dignity. The world knew her worth now, and that was all that mattered. Just as her father was about to speak, a voice interrupted the tense stillness. "Rachel?" The voice was soft, tentative. Rachel turned her head in surprise, her gaze landing on her younger sister Claire, who had appeared in the corner of the room, standing there with a hesitant smile. Claire had been absent from most family gatherings over the years, always on the periphery of their tight-knit circle. Rachel hadn't expected to see her tonight, much less hear her speak. With one swift motion, Claire crossed the room and enveloped Rachel in a warm hug, a stark contrast to the cold atmosphere that had been hanging over them. "I'm so proud of you, Rach," Claire whispered, holding her tightly. "Finally, you told Mum. Finally, they know." Rachel froze, momentarily taken aback by the raw emotion in Claire's voice. This wasn't just about the success. This was about finally being seen for who she was, finally being acknowledged. In the midst of everything, Rachel felt a flicker of something she hadn't expected. A warmth, a connection, something real. As Claire pulled back, she met Rachel's eyes with a look of quiet understanding, as though she had been waiting for this moment for years. Rachel smiled, though it wasn't a smile of triumph. It was something softer, something more personal. Claire had been one of that few people in the family who had never dismissed her dreams, who had always believed in her even when no one else did. Rachel didn't say anything at first. Words seemed unnecessary. She had spent so many years trying to explain herself to people who would never understand, people who had already made up their minds. But here, in this quiet, unexpected moment, it was clear that Claire understood. That was enough. The room remained quiet as the two sisters held each other for a moment longer, the bond between them unspoken but deeply felt. Rachel had never needed validation from anyone, until now. And in this brief moment of connection with Claire, she realised something important. Success, in the end, was about who you become, not just what you accomplish. Rachel turned back to her family, her smile still gentle, still calm. She wasn't going to fight anymore. She wasn't going to argue or make her case. This moment, this quiet strength, was the ultimate victory. As Rachel continued to sit at the table, her family still in stunned silence, she felt a sense of peace settle over her. She wasn't going to need their approval. Not now, not ever again. There was nothing more to prove. She was enough. And she had built something real, something that no one could ever take from her. Rachel felt the weight of her father's gaze long after the family dinner had ended. It was a strange kind of silence that followed the revelation. A silence that was thick with unspoken words and unresolved tension. After everything, her success, the awkward confrontation, it was as if the room had suddenly become too small for both her and her father. "Rachel," her father Richard finally spoke. His voice was low, almost hesitant. "Come with me. I think we need to talk." Rachel's heart sank. She had expected this. She had known the conversation was coming, but that didn't make it any easier. The familiar knot tightened in her stomach as she rose from the table. Her brothers and their families had already retreated to the living room, leaving her alone with Richard. As they walked through the quiet halls of the house, Rachel couldn't help but notice how little it had changed in the years since she had left. The heavy furniture, the dark wood panelling, the old family photos hanging on the walls, all of it seemed like a relic of a time she had long outgrown. And yet the echoes of her childhood still seemed to linger in every corner of this house. They reached Richard's study, a room Rachel had always found intimidating. The walls were lined with bookshelves filled with business books and old family photos. Her father sat behind his desk, a stern figure as always, while Rachel took a seat across from him. The silence between them stretched for a moment before Richard cleared his throat. "I wanted to speak to you in private," he began, his voice heavier now. I owe you an apology, Rachel." Rachel looked at him, her expression unreadable. "An apology?" she asked quietly. "For what?" "For how I treated you," Richard replied, his eyes briefly meeting hers before quickly looking away. "For not supporting you, for not believing in you when I should have." Rachel felt a cold shiver run down her spine. This wasn't the apology she had been hoping for. It wasn't the grand gesture of understanding she had imagined in her dreams. But there was something in his tone, something raw and unspoken, that made her realise this was the closest her father would ever come to acknowledging his mistakes. She had expected anger, bitterness, or even indifference, but instead there was an odd sense of vulnerability in Richard's eyes. It was fleeting, but it was there. "I spent so many years pushing you aside, focusing only on Brian and Sean," he continued, his voice faltering slightly. I thought I was doing the right thing, preparing them to take over the business. But I see now how wrong I was." Rachel said nothing, her gaze steady. She had heard versions of this apology before, but this time it felt different. It felt real. "I didn't give you the chance to prove yourself," Richard added, his tone heavy with regret. "And I can't undo the past, but I need you to know that I am sorry for the way I treated you." For a moment, Rachel was silent. The words, though not perfect, carried a weight she hadn't expected. It wasn't enough to undo the years of neglect, but it was a start, a small, fragile start. "I don't need your apology," Rachel said, her voice calm but firm. "I never did. What I wanted was your recognition. I wanted to be seen for what I could do, not for what I couldn't." Richard looked up at her, his eyes searching, almost as if he were trying to understand the person sitting before him. I thought that you were too stubborn, that you would never fit into the family business. I didn't see you as someone who could lead." Rachel felt a rush of anger rise in her chest, but she tamped it down. This was not the time to lash out. "I never wanted to lead your business, Dad," she said, her voice low. "I wanted to build my own. I wanted to show you, and myself, that I didn't need anyone's permission to succeed." The words hung in the air between them. Richard remained silent, his face unreadable. Rachel, however, felt a sense of finality settle within her. She wasn't here to fight for a seat at the table anymore. She had earned her place in the world, and that was enough. "I did it on my own," Rachel continued, "and that's what you'll never understand. You thought I was running away from the family, but I was building something bigger than any of us." Richard leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled in thought. He looked at her, perhaps seeing her for the first time in years. "You've done more than I ever imagined," he said quietly. "But why didn't you ever tell us? Why keep it all a secret?" Rachel's eyes softened. "I didn't need to. I didn't want you to think that this success came from you. It came from me, from my own hard work." There was a long pause, but this time Rachel didn't feel the need to fill it with words. She had already said everything that needed to be said. Her father, though still silent, seemed to be processing her words. Then, as if to shift the conversation, Rachel gently changed the subject. "Do you remember Mrs. Bennet?" she asked, her tone lighter now. "She's the reason I'm here, the reason I kept going when you told me I was wasting my time with computers." Richard looked at her, confused for a moment, before realization flickered in his eyes. "Yes," he said slowly, "I remember her. She was the teacher you always spoke so highly of." Rachel nodded. "She passed away a few years ago, But before she died, I set up a scholarship fund in her name. It's for young women pursuing STEM fields, just like I did." Her father blinked, then nodded, though he didn't say anything. It wasn't the reaction she had expected, but it was enough. Rachel leaned back in her chair, the weight of the conversation still lingering in the air. The silence between her and her father had become strangely comfortable, as if both of them were processing everything they had just shared. There was no anger now, no bitterness, just an understanding, however fragile, that they were finally facing the truth. Richard seemed to be struggling with something, his fingers tapping on the edge of his desk, his gaze distant as if he were lost in thought. Rachel, though, had moved on from the past. She wasn't interested in what had happened anymore. She wasn't interested in getting her father's approval or seeking out a validation that she had long stopped needing. What mattered now was moving forward. She stood up slowly, feeling a slight tension in her chest. "I want to show you something," Rachel said, her voice steady. She walked to her bag and pulled out a thick envelope. She placed it on the desk, looking at her father, whose eyes followed the movement. Richard raised an eyebrow. "What's this?" Rachel didn't answer immediately. Instead, she carefully opened the envelope and pulled out a well-worn letter. It wasn't a business letter, but one from years ago. As she unfolded the paper, she saw the familiar, careful handwriting. Her father's. He had never been one for emotional displays, and Rachel knew the significance of this letter. It was a rare glimpse into the man who had, in his own way, tried to protect her. But the moment she handed it over, she realised how much she had changed, how much her perspective had shifted. This letter was not just a relic of the past, it was a key to understanding what had brought them here today. "Read it," Rachel said quietly, as she watched Richard's face closely. Her father took the letter in his hands and started to read, his brow furrowing as the words sank in. As Richard read, Rachel watched his expression transform. She could see the familiar stoicism begin to crack, the walls he had so carefully built around his emotions starting to crumble. The letter was a simple one, written when Rachel had been at a crossroads, questioning whether she should continue with her education or join the family business. Richard had written it to her mother, a letter she had never seen. The letter read, "I know Rachel doesn't believe it, but I'm doing this because I care. She won't understand why I'm not pushing her to join the business. She's my daughter, and I want her to have a life of her own. I want her to build something meaningful, even if she doesn't see it yet. I won't stop her from making her own decisions, even if it means she goes down a path I can't understand." Richard paused as he read the last line, his voice barely above a whisper. "I never knew you had kept this," he said, looking up at Rachel. "I never knew you'd see this side of me." Rachel remained silent. The letter was not a grand gesture of love. It wasn't an apology or a confession of deep care. But it was enough for Rachel to understand that, for all his flaws, her father had tried in his own way to protect her, even if he couldn't show it, even if he couldn't express it the way she had wanted him to. The walls around Richard had always been too thick for her to penetrate, but now, in this fragile moment, she saw that there had been more than just rejection. There had been quiet, unspoken care. Richard set the letter down gently, his eyes now meeting Rachel's with a vulnerability that she hadn't expected. I don't know what to say," he admitted, his voice rough. "I didn't know I was doing this. I didn't know I was pushing you away for the right reasons." Rachel nodded. "You didn't, Dad. And I didn't understand it either. I spent years wanting you to see me, to validate me. But I didn't need your validation to become who I am today. I wanted something different. I wanted to create something that would make a difference, not for you, but for myself." Her father sighed deeply, leaning back in his chair. "I always thought I was doing the right thing by sticking to the rules, by holding on to tradition. But what I see now is that you've built something greater than I ever could have imagined." Rachel didn't feel the need to say anything more about her accomplishments, about the company or the money. That wasn't the point. What mattered now was understanding. What mattered was knowing that she hadn't just been rejected out of spite or neglect. Her father had tried in his own way to give her the space to grow. It had been painful, yes, but in the end it had been her strength that had carried her through. I built Healthbridge because I wanted to change the world, not because I wanted to prove anything to anyone. It wasn't about inheritance or legacy, Rachel said quietly. It was about making a difference, giving other people the chance to change things too. Richard sat in silence, processing her words. He wasn't the type to apologise in grand gestures, and Rachel knew that. But in that moment, there was something there, an understanding that had eluded them for so many years. A small, fragile hope that maybe they could move forward, slowly but surely. They sat in silence, no more words needed. The quiet between them, though still tense, was now less filled with bitterness and more with an unspoken possibility. Rachel knew their relationship would never be perfect. It could never be what she had once imagined. But it was real, and that was enough for now. Her father looked at her one last time, and she saw something new in his eyes, something that spoke of acceptance, even if it was tentative. "I'm proud of you, Rachel. I should have said it sooner." Rachel didn't say anything in return. Instead, she just nodded, the weight of the moment sinking in. The apology wasn't perfect, but it was real, and that was the first step towards something new. The days after the conversation with her father felt surreal. Rachel had always imagined that the weight of her father's indifference would crush her, but instead it had lifted. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the cracks that had formed between them began to heal. The apology was small, fragile and imperfect, but it was there, and that was more than she had ever expected. It was late afternoon when Rachel found herself sitting in the cosy living room of the Turner house, the warmth of the fireplace flickering in the background. Her mother, Ellen, had been unusually quiet since the dinner, but there was an energy in the air now, a softness in the way her mother moved around the room. Rachel hadn't expected to see her mother until dinner that night. But as she glanced up, she found her mother standing near the mantel, carefully dusting off the family photos. Ellen looked up, her hands stilling as she caught Rachel's gaze. "Rachel," she said, her voice a bit unsteady, "there's something I've been meaning to tell you." Rachel watched as her mother slowly walked over to the chair beside her, sitting down with an air of hesitance. The distance between them had always been there, not from a lack of love, but from a lifetime of being a quiet observer in the family, never fully taking part in the decisions that had always been made by her father. "Mum, what's wrong?" Rachel asked, sensing the unease in her mother's posture. "I've kept something from you," Ellen began, her voice soft but filled with an underlying emotion. "When you were still in school, when you first started at Stanford, I couldn't help but feel, I don't know, lost. I didn't understand why you chose such a hard path, why you went so far away and didn't ask for our help. But I never told you that. I didn't want to make it harder for you." Rachel felt a pang in her chest. The quiet understanding she had always craved from her mother was finally coming to the surface. "I kept every article, every mention of your successes," Ellen continued, her voice breaking slightly. "I couldn't bring myself to tell you. I didn't want to admit to your father that I was proud of you. He never saw it. I never thought he would." Rachel blinked, shocked by the admission. She had never known. In the years of silence and distance, she had believed her mother to be as distant as her father, just a passive observer in the background of the family's business. But this was different. Ellen reached into the drawer of the side table, pulling out a thick folder filled with articles, press clippings, and photos of Rachel's accomplishments over the years. As she handed the folder to Rachel, her hands trembled slightly. "I kept these," her mother whispered. "I kept them because I was proud of you, even if I didn't know how to show it, even if your father didn't see it." Rachel's throat tightened as she leafed through the folder. There were pictures from the earliest days of Healthbridge AI, headlines that celebrated her breakthroughs, the partnerships she had forged. It was all there, the evidence of a journey that had begun with nothing but a dream and had turned into something that would change lives. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" Rachel asked softly, looking up at her mother. "I thought you knew," Ellen replied, her voice a little too tight. "But I also thought you didn't need me to. You had your father's approval, or so I thought." Rachel sat there, the weight of her mother's words slowly sinking in. She had always felt alone in her success, believing that her family had never truly understood her path. But now, for the first time, she realised that her mother had been there all along, quietly in the background, supporting her from afar. As the room settled into a silence that was no longer uncomfortable but peaceful, Rachel felt a shift within herself. There were no grand apologies to be made here, no dramatic confrontation to resolve. It was the small, quiet recognition that mattered. The connection, once distant and strained, was now open and warm. Rachel's thoughts were interrupted by a sudden, unexpected voice. "I owe you an apology." She looked up in surprise. It was Brian, her older brother, the one who had always been the golden child, the one who had never once shown any real interest in her work or her life. But now, standing in the doorway, Brian looked different. His usual air of superiority had been replaced with something more sincere, something Rachel hadn't seen in him before. "Brian," she asked, her voice tentative. "I've been thinking about everything you said at dinner," he began, stepping into the room and sitting down across from her. "I've never really taken the time to understand what you were doing or what you've been through. I just assumed... I assumed you'd always just be doing your tech thing. But you're not just doing something, you're building something, something real." Rachel was taken aback. This wasn't the apology she had expected. Brian wasn't offering some dramatic declaration of change. Instead, he was quietly admitting something that, to Rachel, was more valuable than anything her father could have said. He was recognising her for who she was, not for the role she had always been forced into by their father. "I was wrong to overlook you," he continued. "I've always been so caught up in the business. I didn't realise how much you were doing, how much you've done." Rachel smiled slightly, though it wasn't one of triumph. It was one of quiet acceptance. "Thanks, Brian. That means more than you think." The rest of the evening passed in a quiet, understated way. No more confrontations, no more shocking revelations. Just small steps, one after the other, as Rachel found herself reconnecting with her family in ways she never thought possible. Her mother's quiet pride and Brian's unexpected apology were not grand gestures, but they were enough to start the process of healing the old wounds. Rachel realised that family didn't have to be perfect. It just had to be real. As she sat back in her chair, looking at the folder in her hands, Rachel felt a quiet sense of peace. She wasn't alone anymore, and in the soft, tentative conversations that followed, she could see that her family was slowly learning to see her, not as the girl who had been overlooked, but as the woman who had built something worth respecting. The following week, Rachel sat at her desk, sipping her coffee, as the soft hum of the city filled her apartment. The company was thriving as it always had, and the quiet rhythm of her success had become a comfort. Yet something in her felt different now. The events of the past few days, the dinner, the conversations with her father and brother, had shifted something deep within her. She wasn't sure what it was yet, but she could feel it, a quiet, delicate change, like the first signs of spring after a long winter. Her phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. The name on the screen was familiar. Bennett Scholarship Fund. Rachel's heart skipped a beat. She had almost forgotten about the scholarship, the one she had established in honour of Mrs. Bennett, the teacher who had first believed in her all those years ago. She hadn't checked her email about it in months. With a sense of anticipation, she opened the message. The subject line read, "Exciting news, Bennett Scholarship Fund expansion." Rachel clicked on the email, her eyes scanning the text rapidly, and then her breath caught. "We are thrilled to inform you that due to your remarkable contributions and dedication to fostering STEM education, the Bennett Scholarship Fund will be increasing its financial support fivefold for the upcoming year. We are expanding to help more young women pursuing STEM degrees, and your work has been instrumental in making this possible." Rachel blinked, rereading the message. The email went on to detail how her work in health tech had caught the attention of major philanthropists, whose donations had now significantly boosted the scholarship's funds. More students would now be able to access the resources they needed to pursue their dreams. The impact Rachel had envisioned was starting to unfold, no longer confined to her own success, but now spreading to others. Her heart swelled with a mixture of pride and excitement. This wasn't just about her. This was about creating change, about passing on the gift of opportunity to the next generation of women in STEM. For the first time in a long while, Rachel felt a rush of pure joy. Not for the money, not for the accolades, but for the ripple effect of her actions. This was the kind of legacy she had always wanted to build. She sat back in her chair, staring out of the window, her mind racing with possibilities. 5 times the funding meant 5 times the impact. More scholarships, more students, more chances for young women to step into the world of technology, healthcare and science. Rachel had built her company for this very reason, not just for her own success, but for the opportunity to change lives. As the excitement began to settle, Rachel's phone buzzed again, pulling her back to the present. This time it was a text from Brian. "Hey Rachel, we need to talk. Can we meet?" Rachel's brow furrowed. She wasn't sure what this was about, but she agreed to meet him at their parents' house later that evening. She was curious to hear what he had to say, especially after the conversation at the dinner table. When Rachel arrived at the Turner house that evening, she found Brian and Sean sitting together on the couch, both of them looking unusually serious. The tension in the air was palpable, but there was something softer in their posture this time. There was no bravado, no casual dismissal of her achievements, just the quiet recognition of what had passed between them in the last few days. Brian motioned for her to sit down. "Rachel, we wanted to talk to you," he began. "I know things have been complicated between us for a long time, but I think I finally get it. What you've done, what you've built, it's impressive, and I'm sorry I never took the time to appreciate it before." Rachel smiled, but it wasn't a smile of triumph. It was one of understanding. She had spent years fighting for the approval of her family, especially Brian and Sean. But now, with the weight of her success and her journey behind her, she knew she didn't need it. Sean, who had been sitting quietly beside Brian, spoke up. "Rachel, I just want you to know that I'm proud of you. And I mean it. I've always looked up to you, but I didn't know how to say it. You've done something incredible, and I want to learn from you. I want to learn about technology, about how you've made HealthBridge AI what it is today. I've always admired you, but now I want to be a part of that world." Rachel felt a warmth spread through her. It wasn't the kind of admiration she had always craved from her family, but it was the kind that came from genuine respect. Sean had never been the one to show much interest in her career. But now, sitting there beside Brian, his words were different. They were real. She met their eyes, feeling a mixture of emotions. Gratitude, warmth, and something else, something softer, something that spoke of the bond they were starting to rebuild. "Thank you," she said, her voice steady but filled with sincerity. "Both of you. This means more to me than you know." Brian and Sean nodded, their expressions softening. Rachel could see that the distance between them was beginning to close, brick by brick. It wasn't going to be easy, and it wasn't going to happen overnight, but this was the beginning of something new. As the evening wore on, Rachel felt the shift. The family wasn't perfect, it never had been, but for the first time she felt like she belonged. Not because of her success or her accomplishments, but because they were beginning to see her for who she truly was, and that in the end was enough. A year had passed and everything had changed. Rachel's black SUV hummed down the familiar road leading to the Turner house. The snow had long melted and the streets of Brookhaven seemed just a little brighter, a little livelier. It had been 12 months since that fateful Christmas dinner, and she was returning for the first time with a sense of calm confidence, something she hadn't felt walking into this house in years. She wasn't the same woman who had arrived last Christmas, broken, seeking validation. No, now she was Rachel Turner, founder of HealthBridge AI, a woman who had carved her path, built her empire, and proved her worth to the world. As she parked her car in the driveway, Rachel took a deep breath. The house, with its tall pillars and familiar architecture, stood before her like an old friend. But this time, when she looked at it, it didn't feel like a house filled with judgment or coldness. It felt like a place where she could finally belong. It was a place of family, one that was finally beginning to understand her. Rachel stepped out of the car, her heels clicking on the concrete driveway as she made her way to the door. She no longer felt the need to downplay her success. Gone were the days of hiding behind modest clothes and a rented car. She had earned everything she had, and it was time to embrace it. Her mother, Ellen, opened the door before she even rang the bell. This time there was no hesitation in her mother's smile, no nervousness. The warmth in her eyes, the way she enveloped Rachel in a tight hug, was all Rachel needed to know, that things had truly changed. "You're here," Ellen said, pulling Rachel into the house. "We've been waiting for you." Rachel smiled, feeling the same love she had always known from her mother, but now it felt like something deeper, more genuine. Inside, the house was filled with laughter and chatter, the once stiff atmosphere now replaced by a sense of ease. The dining room was filled with the same faces, her brothers, Brian and Sean, and their families. But something was different. There was a change in the air, a new sense of openness, and Rachel could feel it the moment she stepped into the room. Brian and Sean were deep in conversation with their wives, but when they saw Rachel, they both stood up to greet her. The awkwardness that had once hung between them was gone. There were no forced smiles, no pretenses, just a genuine, quiet respect. "Rachel, it's good to see you," Brian said, his voice more sincere than it had ever been. He motioned for her to join them at the table. "We've been working on some exciting things. You'll want to hear about it." Rachel raised an eyebrow. "Exciting things?" Sean nodded, his expression a little more relaxed than usual. "Yeah, we've been integrating AI into the manufacturing processes. It's been a game changer. We could really use your expertise." Rachel's heart swelled. This was what she had always wanted. And not just the recognition from her family, but the opportunity to share her knowledge, to be a part of something bigger, to make an impact beyond her own company. This was the bridge she had been trying to build for so long, the one that connected her passion with their vision. And now they were finally ready to see it. "I'd love to help," Rachel said, her voice steady and confident. "Let's talk about it." As they sat down at the table, the conversation flowed smoothly, filled with new ideas and a shared sense of purpose. Rachel didn't have to convince anyone of her worth. The respect was there, built on the foundation of the hard work she had done to get to this point. For the first time in her life, she felt like she truly belonged in this family, not because of her bloodline or because she had proven herself, but because they had accepted her for who she was. Her father, Richard, who had once been a figure of cold authority, sat across the table from her, his gaze softening as he watched the conversation unfold. He wasn't the same man he had been a year ago. The walls he had built around himself were slowly coming down, piece by piece. The man who had once treated her like an outsider now saw her as an equal, someone whose ideas mattered. "I've been thinking about how we can use HealthBridge AI's technology to improve our production processes," Richard said, his voice calm, but there was a new respect in his tone. "Maybe we can collaborate more closely moving forward." Rachel smiled, feeling a surge of pride. She had always wanted to help them see the value of her work, but now it was more than just about her. It was about building something together. She nodded, her eyes meeting his. "That's exactly what I want," she said. "To create something that lasts, something that will make a difference." The evening continued with more conversation, more ideas, and more shared experiences. As they talked, Rachel couldn't help but reflect on how far they had come. The family that had once felt so distant, so cold, was now starting to come together. They were building bridges, not walls. When the evening came to a close, Rachel stood up from the table, feeling a deep sense of fulfillment. She had come full circle. She had built her success on her own terms, but now she was beginning to see that she could be part of something bigger, something that included her family, but also extended beyond it. She wasn't just the daughter anymore. She was an integral part of their world, and they were a part of hers. As she said her goodbyes and walked towards the door, her mother pulled her aside, giving her a final lingering hug. "I'm so proud of you, Rachel. I always have been, and I'm glad you're finally home." Rachel squeezed her mother's hand, feeling a sense of peace settle over her. "I'm glad to be home, Mom. I'm glad to be here." For the first time in years, Rachel felt the warmth of her family, not as a burden but as a blessing, and as she stepped out into the cool night, she realised that this was just the beginning. The connections had been rebuilt, not just with her family, but with herself, and that was the greatest success of all. The following week, Rachel sat at her desk in her office, reflecting on the changes that had slowly but surely begun to reshape her life. The conversation at the Turner household had left a lasting impression, not just because of the reconciliation with her father and brothers, but because of the quiet realization that things could indeed be different. For the first time in years, Rachel felt that she was no longer just an outsider looking in. She was finally a part of something bigger, her family, her legacy, but little did she know that night would mark another turning point. The evening was crisp as Rachel walked into the Turner house again, this time for a family celebration. The house, lit warmly from the inside, felt like a place of possibility now. The dinner was laid out on the table, and the hum of conversation filled the air, a stark contrast to the uncomfortable silences that had plagued the previous family gatherings. This was different. It wasn't just the success Rachel had brought to the table. It was the genuine respect and warmth that had started to envelop the family. Richard, her father, stood at the head of the table, a glass of wine in hand. He was about to make an announcement, a familiar routine at these gatherings, but this time there was something in his posture, something more relaxed, more open. "Family," Richard began, his voice carrying easily through the room. "I have an important announcement to make." He paused for effect, his eyes moving across the room. "After much thought and careful planning, we are excited to launch the Wilson Innovation Fund." A murmur rippled through the room as everyone turned their attention to him. Rachel had no idea what this could mean. The Wilson family had always been business-oriented, focused on manufacturing and profit, but the mention of innovation sounded like something new, something different. Richard continued, "This fund will be dedicated to supporting the next generation of entrepreneurs, particularly those working in technology, healthcare and sustainability. We're opening it up with an initial fund, and the goal is to support groundbreaking projects that can change the world." Rachel felt a knot form in her stomach. This was huge. A fund like that could do so much for the kind of work she believed in. But then Richard said something that surprised her. "The fund will also be partnering with the expanded Bennett Scholarship," Richard continued, "which will now be led by someone you all know well. It will be spearheaded by none other than Chloe, our very own, who proposed the idea for the scholarship's expansion and has become the driving force behind this initiative." Rachel's jaw dropped as she turned her head towards Chloe, her young niece, who had been sitting quietly at the table, her eyes wide with excitement. Chloe, the girl who had been so quiet and reserved, was the one who had pushed for this fund. Rachel's heart swelled as she realised the full weight of what this meant. It wasn't just her father coming around. It wasn't just about the legacy of the Turner family anymore. This was proof that Rachel's impact had extended far beyond her own success. Chloe, the young girl who had once whispered her admiration for Rachel, was now the one who was shaping the future of their family's philanthropic efforts. It was a moment of undeniable truth. Rachel had built a foundation for others to stand on. Chloe stood up, her face flushed with pride as she addressed the room. "I've always looked up to Aunt Rachel," she said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "Her work in tech inspired me, and I wanted to make sure other girls had the same opportunities. I think the future is about sharing what we have and helping others get to where they want to go. This isn't just about one person succeeding, it's about creating a ripple effect of success." Rachel's heart swelled as she looked at Chloe, seeing the same spark she had seen in herself all those years ago, when she first dreamed of building something that mattered. But now it was more than just Rachel's dream. It was Chloe's dream too. It was their dream. The room was quiet for a moment, but the sense of unity that Rachel had longed for finally filled the air. Chloe was standing on the shoulders of those who had come before her, Rachel, Mrs. Bennett, and all the women who had fought for a place in a world that had once overlooked them. The family that had once dismissed Rachel was now supporting a movement that would make a lasting impact. The tension of the past had melted away, replaced by a shared vision of the future. As the evening wore on, Rachel found herself standing next to her father. They exchanged a brief but significant look. This wasn't just about business. This wasn't about legacy. It was about creating something real, something meaningful. The Wilson Innovation Fund wasn't just a new project. It was a new chapter, one that embraced the future, the new generation, and the power of collaboration. Rachel felt a quiet peace settle in her heart. She had worked so hard to prove herself, to fight for her place in a world that had never made space for her. But now she realised that the success she had fought for was more than just about her. It was about making room for others, lifting them up, and creating a future that was built on love and commitment, not just money. As the night drew to a close, Rachel stood outside, looking up at the stars. The world was full of possibilities. The future was no longer a solitary journey. It was a shared path, one she walked with the people she had always longed to connect with, her family, and that, she realised, was the greatest success of all. Success isn't just about what we inherit from our parents, Rachel said softly to herself. Success is about designing the future with love, commitment, and the courage to change the world together.